The heavy iron gates of Blackwood Manor didn't just creak. They groaned like a dying beast, a sound that echoed across the frost-bitten valley and chilled the marrow of the hundreds of women lined up outside. They came in silks, in velvet, and in desperation, lured by the promise of a crown but blinded to the price of the challenge. For 3 years the Duke's seat had remained vacant of a duchess, not for lack of candidates, but because every woman who entered the trial of the Crimson Rose left in tears or worse in silence. The challenge was a psychological gauntlet designed to break the spirit, curated by a man whose heart was rumored to be made of the same cold obsidian as his castle walls. One by one the elite daughters of the kingdom failed. One by one they realized that the Duke wasn't looking for a wife. He was looking for a mirror to a soul he had long ago discarded. But as the final noblewoman fled the hall, screaming that the man was a monster, a small rhythmic sound broke the heavy silence of the courtyard. It wasn't the clip-clop of a carriage or the rustle of a gown. It was the soft sandpaper scratch of a broom against stone. Hello to all of you incredible souls tuning in today. I am so happy to have you back at the hearth of our storytelling community. Before we dive deeper into the shadows of Blackwood Manor, I want to take a moment to welcome you. Whether you're watching from the rainy streets of London, the vibrant heart of Lagos, or a quiet corner of Tokyo, please let me know in the comments where you're joining us from. How are you truly doing today? I hope this story finds you well, but if you're looking for an escape, you've come to the right place. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and join our family. Your support is the heartbeat of this channel, and I wouldn't want you to miss a single twist in the tale we're about to weave. Ellen Ripley, a name whispered only in the servants' quarters and never in the grand ballroom, stood in the periphery of the great hall, her knuckles white around the wooden handle of her mop. She was a shadow among shadows, a girl whose existence was measured in the cleanliness of baseboards and the lack of fingerprints on silver platters. To the world, she was invisible, but beneath the rough wool of her uniform beat a heart that had been forged in the fires of survival. While the countesses and baronesses preened and practiced their smiles, Ellen had spent years watching the Duke from the corners of rooms. She saw the way his jaw tightened when the wind howled. She noticed the specific book he touched but never opened. She heard the hollow resonance in his voice that spoke of a grief so vast it had become a physical weight. The Duke Bruce Wayne sat upon his dais, his eyes 2 chips of ice in a face of chiseled stone. He didn't look at the women, he looked through them. To him they were nothing but ambitious dolls, sent by fathers who wanted his gold and cared nothing for the darkness that came with it. Next, he barked, his voice a jagged blade that sliced through the lingering perfume of the last failed candidate. But there was no one left in the line. The guards looked at each other, confused. The challenge had been open to all, but the fear had finally outrun the greed. It was then that Ellen felt a strange, terrifying pull in her chest. It wasn't ambition. It was a recognition. A silent, screaming realization that she was the only person in this entire cursed estate who understood the riddle he was asking. She dropped her cloth. The wet thud echoed in the silent hall like a gunshot. Bruce's head snapped toward the sound, his gaze landing on the girl in the gray pinafore standing near the service door. "The challenge is for the ladies of the realm, girl," the head butler hissed, stepping forward to usher her away. "The decree said any woman," Ellen said, her voice steady despite the hummingbird pulse in her throat. She stepped out of the shadows, the light of the chandeliers finally catching the amber in her eyes. "And I am a woman of this realm." Bruce leaned forward, a predatory curiosity flickering in his dark eyes. He had broken the proudest spirits in the land, and here stood a girl who smelled of lye and wood smoke, daring to look him in the eye. He didn't see a maid. He saw a challenge he hadn't anticipated. "You know the rules, girl?" Bruce asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous velvety low. "If you fail, you leave this manor tonight with nothing but the clothes on your back, barred from service in this kingdom forever. You will be a ghost among the living." "I have lived as a ghost for 19 years, Your Grace," Ellen replied, stepping into the center of the hall, her shadow stretching long and thin across the marble. "Being cast out would only mean the world finally sees me." The Duke stood, the sheer presence of him filling the room until the air felt thin. He walked down the steps of the dais, stopping only inches from her. The scent of rain and old parchment rolled off him. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, tarnished silver key and a single withered black rose. He held them out, his eyes searching hers for a flicker of the fear he usually inspired. "Every woman before you tried to polish the key or revive the rose," Bruce whispered, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "They thought I wanted beauty and restoration. Tell me, quiet maid, what does a man who has everything do with a key that opens nothing and a flower that cannot bloom?" Ellen didn't reach for the items. Instead, she did something that made the guards gasp and the Duke's breath hitch. She reached out and gently closed his hand back over the objects, her warm skin brushing against his cold, calloused palm. "A man who has everything uses the key to lock the door behind him," she whispered, her gaze never wavering. "And he keeps the dead rose to remind himself that some things are too precious to let rot in the ground, even if they can never grow again. You aren't testing our worthiness, Your Grace. You're testing to see if any of us are brave enough to sit with you in the dark." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in 3 years, the Duke of Blackwood didn't look away. He didn't call for the next candidate. He looked at the maid as if he were seeing a person for the very first time, and the seed of a terrifying, beautiful mystery was planted in the frozen soil of his heart. But what lay behind the door that the Duke so desperately wanted to lock? And why did the mention of the dark make the most powerful man in the north tremble? The air in the great hall seemed to crystallize, suspended in a vacuum where only Ellen and the Duke existed. Bruce's hand remained closed, the metal of the key biting into his palm, a physical reminder of the girl's audacity. He didn't pull away. For a heartbeat, the mask of the Beast of Blackwood slipped, revealing a man hollowed out by a haunting he couldn't name. Then with a sharp, jagged exhale he turned his back on her. "Tomorrow at dawn," he commanded, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling. "If you are late by a second, you will be whipped for your insolence before you are banished. You have no idea what you've invited into your life, girl." Ellen didn't flinch. She bowed, not the deep, practiced curtsy of a debutante, but the respectful nod of an equal, and retreated into the servants' corridor. As soon as the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, she leaned against the cold stone wall, her lungs finally demanding the air she had forgotten to breathe. To understand why a mere maid would risk the Duke's wrath, one must understand the life of Ellen Ripley. She wasn't born to the broom. 10 years ago her father, Arthur Ripley, had been the kingdom's most celebrated clockmaker, a man who claimed he could tune the heartbeat of time itself. They had lived in a cottage filled with the rhythmic tick-tock of 1,000 brass gears, a symphony of order and warmth. But when Arthur was commissioned to fix a legendary mechanism for the royal family and failed, he was stripped of his title and disappeared into the fog of the Grey Lands. Ellen had been left with nothing but a broken pocket watch that never moved and a deep-seated fear of things that stood still. She had sought employment at Blackwood Manor not for the coin, but because the manor was a tomb of frozen time. Since the death of Bruce's mother, the Duchess, every clock in the house had been stopped. The Duke lived in a perpetual now, a state of arrested development that mirrored Ellen's own internal stasis. Her deepest desire wasn't wealth. It was to find the gear that had jammed in the machinery of her own life, and she suspected the Duke was holding it. The next morning, the servants' quarters were a hornet's nest of whispers. Clarice Starling, the head housekeeper and the only person Ellen considered a friend, caught her by the arm as she prepared to head to the Duke's private wing. Clarice was a woman of sharp angles and sharper intuition, her eyes softened only by the weary kindness of someone who had seen too many girls broken by the challenge. "Ellen, stop this madness," Clarice hissed, thrusting a piece of dry toast into her hand. "You've seen what he does. He doesn't just reject these women, he unspools them. He finds the one thing they are ashamed of and holds it up to the light. You have secrets, child. We all do. Don't let him turn them into a noose." "He's already holding the rope, Clarice," Ellen replied, her eyes fixed on the grand staircase. "Everyone in this house is just waiting for him to pull it. I'd rather be the one standing on the trapdoor than the one hiding under it." As Ellen ascended the stairs, she passed the portrait gallery. There Bruce's younger brother, Tommy Shelby, lounged against a mahogany table, swirling a glass of amber liquid despite the early hour. Tommy was the Duke's polar opposite, charming, reckless, and possessed of a smile that never quite reached his predatory eyes. He was the spare, the man who stayed in the shadows only because the Duke's shadow was so large. "So the little mouse wants to be a lioness," Tommy drawled, his gaze raking over Ellen's plain uniform. "Tell me, Ripley, is it the title you want?" Or are you just curious to see if my brother's blood is as cold as the rumors say? Word of advice. Bruce doesn't like puzzles he can't solve. And you, with your quiet eyes and your father's ruined reputation, you're a very loud puzzle. Ellen froze. The mention of her father sent a jolt of ice through her veins. I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Shelby. Don't you? Tommy stepped closer, the smell of expensive tobacco and gin cloying in the air. I recognize that look. You're looking for something he took. Just remember, in this house the lost things stay lost for a reason. If you find what you're looking for, you might wish you'd stayed in the shadows. He let her pass, his laughter a low, mocking sound that followed her all the way to the Duke's study. Bruce Wayne was waiting. The room was a labyrinth of books and maps, the only light coming from a dying fire that cast long, flickering silhouettes against the walls. He was dressed in black silk, looking less like a duke and more like a ghost haunted by his own haunting. On the desk between them sat 3 objects. A bowl of salt, a bowl of ash, and a bowl of fresh, clear water. Part 2 of the challenge, Bruce said, his voice gravelly from a night without sleep. The women before you tried to use the water to wash the ash or the salt to preserve the water. They tried to fix what is fundamentally broken. They tried to be useful. Tell me, Alan, if you were to lose everything, your name, your history, the very memory of your father, what would you use to build yourself back up? He watched her intensely, his fingers drumming a rhythmic, restless beat on the desk. This was the moment where he expected her to falter. This was where he checked for the cracks in her armor. But Ellen didn't look at the bowls. She looked at his hands, the way the skin was scarred around the knuckles, the way he flinched at the sound of the wind. I wouldn't use any of them, Ellen said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I would use the silence. Because in the silence, you don't have to pretend you're building anything at all. You just have to exist. Bruce's hand stopped drumming. The air in the room shifted, the tension ratcheting up until it felt like a physical weight on Ellen's shoulders. He stood up, slowly, moving around the desk until he was close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark irises. You think you know me, he breathed, his face inches from hers. You think because you've watched from the corners that you understand the rot in this house. But you are just a girl with a broken watch and a dead man's legacy. You want to sit in the dark? Fine. We will go to the cellar. We will see how much silence you can truly stomach. He grabbed a lantern, the flame jumping wildly. The invitation wasn't just to a room. It was to the very heart of the mystery that had kept Blackwood Manor under a shroud for 3 years. What was hidden in the bowels of the manor that had driven every other woman to madness? And why did Bruce seem so desperate to prove that Ellen was just as fragile as the rest? The air grew colder as they descended, the stone steps slick with a dampness that smelled of ancient iron and forgotten prayers. Bruce didn't hold the lantern for her. He marched ahead, his shadow a flickering giant that seemed to swallow the narrow corridor. Ellen followed, her breath hitching in the rhythmic silence. This was the abyss of Blackwood, the place where the previous daughters of industry and oil had lost their composure, clawing at the walls to be let back into the sunlight. They reached a heavy, reinforced door at the base of the manor. Bruce turned the silver key, the same one he had shown her in the hall, and the mechanism screamed as it gave way. Enter, Bruce whispered, his voice devoid of its earlier bravado. The room was not a dungeon. It was a workshop. But it was a workshop frozen in the middle of a catastrophe. Copper coils hung from the ceiling like disemboweled intestines. Glass vials lay shattered, their contents long evaporated into stains on the floor. In the center of the room sat a massive brass and porcelain sphere, cracked down the middle. My father didn't die of a broken heart, Bruce said, the lantern light reflecting in his wet eyes. He died trying to build a heart. A perpetual motion engine that would have powered this entire kingdom for 1,000 years. He failed. And in failing he blew the soul out of this family. Every woman who came here tried to tell me they could help me finish it. They lied. They wanted the glory of the invention, not the burden of the failure. He turned to her, his face a mask of raw, bleeding agony. You said you wanted to sit in the dark, Ellen Ripley. Well, here it is. The darkness of a dead dream. What do you see? Ellen walked toward the sphere. She didn't touch the brass, she touched the crack. She felt the jagged edge where the pressure had become too much for the metal to bear. I don't see a dream, Ellen said softly. I see a cage. You've turned this room into a shrine to your own guilt, Bruce. You aren't mourning your father. You're punishing yourself for being the one who survived the blast. Bruce lunged forward, grabbing her shoulders. For a moment, Ellen thought he might strike her, but his grip was shaking. The physical proximity was electric, the heat of his body clashing with the tomb-like chill of the cellar. "You know nothing," he roared, but the roar broke into a jagged sob. The inciting incident, however, wasn't his outburst. It was the sound that followed. Tick. A solitary metallic click echoed through the room. It didn't come from the giant sphere. It came from Ellen's pocket. Bruce froze. He backed away, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and sudden violent hope. What was that? Ellen reached into her apron and pulled out the broken pocket watch her father had left her. For 10 years the hands had been welded shut by rust and time. But now, in the presence of the Duke's failed engine, the second hand was shivering. It was fighting to move. "My father's watch," Ellen whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. It's reacting to the sphere." Before Bruce could respond, the heavy door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. The sound of a bolt sliding into place echoed down the corridor. "Bruce? Ellen?" A voice called from behind the door, muffled but unmistakably sharp. It was Tommy Shelby. "I'm afraid the challenge has just taken a turn. You see, brother, the crown is tired of waiting for you to pick a bride. They've decided that if the Duke is found dead in his own laboratory with a lowly maid, the spare is more than ready to step into the light." The lantern on the table flickered and died, plunged into total blackness. "Tommy!" Bruce shouted, throwing himself against the door, but it was reinforced from the outside. "Open this door, you coward." "Enjoy the silence, Ellen." Tommy's voice faded as he walked away. "You said it was all you needed to exist, didn't you?" The first major twist had landed like a guillotine. They weren't just participants in a challenge anymore. They were prisoners in a tomb of their father's making. Ellen felt a hand find hers in the dark. Bruce's fingers were no longer cold. They were gripping hers with a desperate life-or-death intensity. "Ellen," he breathed, his voice right next to her ear. "The watch. Why is it moving now?" "Because," Ellen realized, the mystery clicking into place with terrifying clarity, "my father didn't fail the Royal Commission. He was sabotaged. And the piece he needed to fix the engine. He didn't lose it. He hid it inside this watch. We're not just trapped, Bruce. We're standing on a bomb that's finally started counting down." The stakes had just shifted from a marriage contract to a survival pact. Can a Duke and a Maid bridge the gap of their stations to disarm a decade-old ghost? Or will Tommy Shelby's betrayal be the final tick in the Blackwood legacy? The darkness of the cellar wasn't just an absence of light. It was a physical weight, thick with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of old blood. Bruce's grip on Ellen's hand tightened, his breathing ragged and shallow. For a man who had spent 3 years cultivated an image of untouchable power, he was suddenly reduced to a terrified boy in a dark room. "The watch," Bruce hissed, his voice trembling. "Ripley, if that thing is ticking, it means the kinetic stabilizer in the sphere is drawing a charge. My father. He didn't just build an engine. He built a closed-loop capacitor. If it overloads without a release valve, this entire wing of the manor will be leveled." "We need light," Ellen said, her voice a stark contrast to his panic. Cool, analytical, a product of years spent scrubbing floors while observing the mechanics of the world. "The sparks from the friction. The flint in your pocket, Your Grace. I know you carry it for your pipe." With fumbling fingers, Bruce produced a small piece of flint and a steel striker. The first few attempts produced only pathetic dying sparks that illuminated the terror etched into his sharp features. On the fourth strike, a spark caught a stray piece of oil-soaked rag on the workbench. A small, amber flame blossomed, casting dancing, monstrous shadows against the copper coils. "We have to vent the pressure," Ellen said, moving toward the cracked sphere. Her mind was racing, memories of her father's workshop flooding back, blueprints she wasn't supposed to see, conversations about the golden ratio of tension. But Tommy, he didn't just lock the door. He's been planning this. The whispers in the halls, the way he looked at my watch yesterday. He knew I had the missing piece. He doesn't want the engine, Bruce realized, his eyes narrowing as the Duke's cold intellect began to override his fear. He wants the accident. If I'm vaporized along with the maid who tried to rob me, he inherits everything without a single question asked. As they worked, the romantic tension, previously a simmering undercurrent, bolted into a high-voltage wire. To reach the primary valve, Bruce had to lift Ellen onto the top of the brass housing. His hands hovered at her waist, hesitant before firmly hoisting her up. The contact was electric, a collision of worlds that should never have touched. Ellen could feel the heat of his palms through her thin uniform, a stark reminder that beneath the title and the trauma, he was a man who had been starved of human touch for a lifetime. Left. Bruce shouted as a pipe hissed, spraying a jet of scalding steam inches from Ellen's face. The brass coupling, Ellen. Turn it clockwise. It's seized, she cried out, her fingers straining against the hot metal. I need more leverage. Bruce didn't hesitate. He climbed up beside her, his large frame shielding her from the venting steam. He placed his hands over hers on the valve, their fingers interlacing. In that moment of shared peril, the barrier between Duke and servant evaporated. They were simply two souls fighting to stay in the light. With a collective groan of effort, the valve turned. A deafening whistle echoed through the chamber as the pressure began to drop, but the ticking of the watch didn't slow. It accelerated. It's not just the pressure, Ellen whispered, looking down at the watch through the glass. The hands were spinning now, a blur of gold. It's a proximity trigger. The closer we get to fixing it, the faster it counts down. It's a failsafe. My father didn't hide the piece to protect it. He hid it so that only someone who knew the rhythm of the machine could disarm it. Suddenly, a heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards above them. Then another. The sound of furniture being moved, of heavy boots pacing. He's barricading the exit, Bruce said, his jaw set in a line of grim fury. He's making sure that even if we survive the blast, we never breathe fresh air again. Ellen looked at Bruce, really looked at him. The soot on his forehead, the desperation in his eyes, and the strange, budding tenderness he was showing her. Bruce, why did you really start this challenge? It wasn't just to find a wife. You were looking for someone who could see through the engine, weren't you? Bruce leaned back against the sphere, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. I was looking for someone who wouldn't run when the mask slipped. Every noblewoman saw the Duke. You saw the wreckage. And you didn't look away. He reached out, his thumb brushing a smudge of grease from her cheek. The gesture was so intimate, so profoundly out of place in their tomb, that Ellen felt her heart skip a beat that had nothing to do with the machine. If we get out of here, Bruce whispered, his face inches from hers, I am going to burn every decree and every law that says you belong in the shadows. Don't make promises to a ghost, Your Grace, Ellen replied, though she didn't pull away. The moment was shattered by a violent tremor. The sphere groaned and a deep rhythmic thrumming began to vibrate through the floor, the sound of a heart trying to beat after a decade of silence. The tension had reached its breaking point. The engine was waking up, but it wasn't the savior Bruce's father had intended. It was a dying scream of metal and fire. How could a maid with a broken watch stop a catastrophe that was 10 years in the making, especially when the man she was beginning to love was the very person the machine was designed to destroy? The vibration in the floor became a low-frequency hum that rattled Ellen's teeth. The brass sphere was no longer just a static object. It was beginning to glow with a faint, ghostly cerulean light that seeped through the cracks in its porcelain skin. The stabilizer isn't just drawing a charge, Bruce, Ellen shouted over the rising roar of the machine. It's searching. It's looking for the anchor. Bruce grabbed her waist, pulling her back as a localized discharge of static electricity arched from the sphere to a nearby iron rack, melting the metal instantly. In the strobe-like flashes of blue light, his face looked skeletal, haunted. The anchor was my mother's wedding ring, Bruce confessed, his voice cracking. My father didn't just use clockwork, Ellen. He used bioresonance. He believed that the human heart's frequency could stabilize the infinite energy of the vacuum. When she died, the engine went critical because it lost its living pulse. He tried to replicate it with mechanics, but he couldn't. He couldn't simulate love. Ellen's hand flew to the pocket watch. The missing piece her father had hidden wasn't a gear or a spring. She fumbled with the casing, her fingers slick with sweat, and pried the back of the watch open. Inside, nested in a bed of velvet and fine copper wire, was a small, pulsing crystal that beat in perfect synchronization with her own frantic heart. It's not a machine, Bruce, Ellen whispered, the revelation hitting her like a physical blow. My father didn't sabotage the Royal Commission. He realized what they wanted to do with it. They didn't want free energy. They wanted a weapon that responded to the intent of the wielder. He gave it to me because I was the only thing he loved more than his craft. I am the anchor. The Duke recoiled, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and a devastating newfound clarity. The challenge hadn't been a search for a wife. It had been a subconscious search for the frequency that matched the one he had lost. He hadn't been looking for a duchess. He had been looking for a soul that could restart his world. You're the daughter of the man who saved the world by breaking it, Bruce breathed, stepping toward her despite the lethal arcs of energy. And Tommy, he doesn't just want the title. He found the blueprints. He knows that if he kills the anchor while the engine is live, the feedback loop will create a blast that wipes out every rival to the throne in a 10-mile radius. As the realization settled, the romantic tension that had been building between the highborn duke and the lowly maid shifted into something far more profound. A shared destiny. Bruce didn't see a servant anymore. He saw the guardian of a power that could either save their kingdom or turn it into a graveyard. He reached out, taking both of her hands in his. The cerulean light from the sphere wrapped around them, binding them in a shimmering cocoon. For the first time, the Duke didn't flinch from the touch. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "If this is the end," Bruce whispered, his voice thick with a vulnerability he had never shown another living soul, "know that I didn't find you because of a challenge. I found you because my heart finally recognized its own rhythm." But the moment of shared passion was violently interrupted. A heavy, metallic clack echoed from the ceiling. "How touching," Tommy Shelby's voice boomed through a ventilation grate high above. "The beast and the beauty, dying in a glow of blue light. But I'm afraid the countdown is no longer in your hands, brother. I've just released the primary coolant. In 5 minutes that sphere becomes a sun. And since Ellen is the anchor, her heart will be the first thing to fuse." The stakes had reached their zenith. It wasn't just about escaping a room anymore. To save the manor and the thousands of people in the valley below, Ellen would have to find a way to merge her father's legacy with Bruce's father's failure. A feat that required her to step directly into the center of the storm. Could Ellen survive the integration with the engine, or was she destined to become the very thing that destroyed the Blackwood line? And as the heat in the room began to rise to unbearable levels, Bruce was faced with a choice. Let the woman he loved sacrifice herself to save his legacy, or find a way to break the machine once and for all. The blue glow from the sphere intensified until it was a blinding, ultraviolet roar, a visual scream that filled every corner of the workshop. The heat was no longer just a temperature. It was an abrasive force, peeling the paint from the walls and causing the very air to crackle with the scent of burning ozone. "Ellen, get back!" Bruce shouted, but his voice was drowned out by a violent tectonic shift in the machinery. The floor beneath them buckled. A massive steam pipe, weakened by years of neglect and the sudden thermal expansion, sheared off its mountings with the force of a cannon blast. It whipped through the air, striking the catwalk where they stood. With a sickening crunch of twisting iron, the platform tilted. Ellen felt the world tip. She reached for Bruce, her fingers grazing the rough wool of his sleeve, but the momentum was too great. She slid toward the edge, the abyss of the cooling pit yawning below her. "Bruce!" she screamed, but as she fell, a secondary explosion of sparks and steam erupted between them, a wall of white-hot vapor that acted as a physical barrier. She hit the lower level with a bone-jarring thud, the wind knocked out of her. Above, through the swirling mist, she saw Bruce's silhouette sharp against the cerulean light. He was hanging from a shattered rail, his hand outstretched, but the gap between them was now a lake of electrified air and hissing steam. "I can't reach you," Bruce bellowed, his face contorted in an expression of such pure, unadulterated despair that it hurt more than the fall. "Ellen, stay still. The ground is live." "The anchor." Ellen gasped, clutching the watch to her chest. "Bruce, the crystal. It's burning me." It was true. The stone inside the pocket watch was no longer pulsing. It was vibrating at a frequency that felt like it was trying to disassemble her atoms. Every beat of her heart was met with a jagged spike of energy from the device. She was being pulled toward the sphere by an invisible magnetic tide. The machine didn't just want her. It was consuming her. "Tommy, you bastard." Bruce's voice echoed from above, directed at the ventilation grate. "Turn it off. You'll kill us all." "That's the idea, big brother." Tommy's voice drifted down, cold and detached. "A tragic accident. The Duke and his secret paramour, lost to a legacy he couldn't control. I've already sent word to the capital. They're expecting a funeral, not a wedding. The silence that followed was the worst part. The realization that they were entirely alone, trapped in a malfunctioning tomb with no help coming. Bruce was trapped on the upper tier, his path to the stairs blocked by fire, and Ellen was trapped in the pit, her very life force being drained by the machine her father had tried to save her from. For the first time, Ellen felt the cold hand of true hopelessness. She looked at the Duke, the man who had spent his life building walls of stone and silence to keep the world out, only to have those walls become his own cage. And she looked at herself, the girl who thought she could change the rhythm of a broken world with a mop and a dream. "I'm sorry, Bruce," she whispered, tears tracking lines through the soot on her face. "I thought I could fix it. I thought we had more time." The sphere began to hum a high, piercing note, the sound of a star about to go supernova. The blue light turned a lethal, bruised purple. The separation was total. The obstacles were insurmountable. The man she loved was a ghost in the steam, and the life she wanted was being incinerated in the heart of a dead man's engine. As the darkness of their situation reached its absolute nadir, and the heat began to blister the skin, a single rhythmic sound broke through the chaos. It wasn't the machine. It wasn't Tommy. It was something buried deep within the clockwork of the manor itself, a secret even the Duke didn't know. The high, piercing note of the engine reached a frequency that shattered the remaining glass vials in the room, the shards raining down like diamond dust. But beneath that mechanical scream, the rhythmic sound Ellen had heard grew louder. It wasn't a tick or a thud. It was a melody, a low, haunting chime echoing through the ventilation shafts. "The lullaby," Bruce whispered from the ledge, his eyes widening. "My mother's music box. It was built into the foundations of the house." The realization struck Ellen like a bolt of lightning. The engine didn't just need a physical anchor. It needed a harmonic resonance. The bioresonance Bruce's father had obsessed over wasn't just about a heartbeat. It was about the emotional frequency of a specific memory. The machine was a massive brass ear, and it was finally hearing the song it had been built to amplify. "Bruce, the music isn't coming from the house," Ellen shouted, pushing herself up from the vibrating floor. Her hands were blistered, but the pain was distant, drowned out by a surge of adrenaline that tasted like copper and hope. "It's coming from the vents. Tommy didn't just release the coolant, he opened the secondary acoustics. He's accidentally giving us the key." In that moment of clarity, the hopelessness that had weighed her down evaporated. Ellen looked at the pocket watch. The crystal inside wasn't trying to consume her, it was trying to align with her. It wasn't a battery. It was a tuning fork. "I have to get to the core, Bruce," she yelled, eyeing the gap of electrified air. "If I can place the crystal directly into the primary induction coil, the music will stabilize the field." "It'll kill you, Ellen. The discharge alone will fry your nervous system." Bruce scrambled along the shattered catwalk, his fingers bleeding as he gripped the jagged metal. He saw a heavy copper cooling cable dangling near his position. Without a second thought, he leaped. He swung through the steam, a dark shadow cutting through the cerulean mist, and landed hard on the lower level beside her. He didn't wait for her to speak. He grabbed her, pulling her into a fierce, desperate embrace. The heat of the room was blistering, but the heat between them was a different kind of fire, a transformative, healing flame. "We do it together," Bruce said, his voice no longer trembling. He took the watch from her hand, his larger fingers steadying hers. "I am the blood of the man who built this. You are the soul of the man who perfected it. The machine won't reject both of us." They turned toward the glowing sphere. The purple light was receding, replaced by a steady, golden warmth as the music from the vents harmonized with the crystal. They walked forward step by step, the static electricity dancing across their skin like 1,000 stinging needles. High above, they heard a frantic metallic clanging. "What are you doing?" Tommy's voice screamed, no longer cold but panicked. "The readings are stabilizing. Stop it. You're ruining everything." "We're not ruining it, Tommy," Bruce roared, his voice echoing with the authority of a king. "We're finally finishing it." They reached the center of the storm. The porcelain skin of the engine was white-hot. Together, Ellen and Bruce reached into the heart of the light. They didn't feel the burn. They felt a connection. A bridge of pure energy that spanned the gap between the Duke and the Maid, between the past and the future. As they pressed the crystal into the coil, a massive wave of golden light erupted, not in an explosion, but in a silent, beautiful pulse that swept through the entire manor. The ticking stopped. The humming stopped. The world went silent. In the sudden, heavy quiet, the heavy bolt on the cellar door began to turn. Not from the outside but from the inside, as the manor's automated systems, restored by the engine's surge, recognized their master. The turning point had passed. They were no longer victims of a legacy. They were the architects of a new one. But as the door creaked open, they knew the final confrontation with Tommy Shelby was waiting in the halls above, and the challenge was about to reach its ultimate public conclusion. The heavy vault doors of the laboratory didn't just open. They recoiled, driven by a pneumatic hiss that sounded like the manor itself taking its first breath in a century. Bruce and Ellen emerged from the subterranean mist not as master and servant, but as two pillars of a single unbreakable foundation. Their clothes were scorched, their faces streaked with soot and silver-gray ash, but their eyes held a clarity that made the flickering gaslights of the upper corridors seem dim. As they ascended to the great hall, the silence of the house was gone. Every clock in Blackwood Manor, from the grandfather timepiece in the foyer to the delicate mantel clocks in the guest rooms, began to chime in a chaotic, glorious symphony of regained time. The hall was crowded. Tommy Shelby had gathered the remaining elite, the royal inspectors and the skeptical town council, preparing to deliver the news of the tragic accident. He stood on the dais, a glass of champagne in his hand, his face already practiced in the lines of a mourning brother. "It is with a heavy heart," Tommy began, his voice dripping with faux pathos, "that I must inform you of the explosion in the lower." The double doors at the back of the hall slammed open. The sound was like a thunderclap, cutting Tommy's sentence off at the throat. Bruce Wayne stepped into the light, his hand firmly interlaced with Ellen's. The noblewomen gasped, pulling back their silk skirts as if the soot on Ellen's apron were contagious. But Bruce didn't stop until he reached the foot of the dais, looking up at his brother with a cold, terrifying smile. "The reports of my death, Thomas," Bruce said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vaulted ceiling, "have been greatly and perhaps intentionally exaggerated." "Bruce," Tommy stammered, the glass in his hand trembling until the champagne spilled over the rim. The alarms. We thought the engine went critical. I was just telling them." "You were telling them a lie built on 10 years of sabotage," Bruce countered. He turned to the royal inspector, a man named Victor Frankenstein, who stood frozen with a clipboard in hand. "Inspector, my brother didn't just lock that door. He released the coolant. He tried to trigger a localized collapse to hide the fact that he has been selling the blueprints of my father's research to the highest bidder for years." "That's preposterous," Tommy roared, regaining some of his venom. "Who would believe you? You're a man who spent 3 years talking to shadows. And her." He pointed a shaking finger at Ellen. "She's a thief. She crept into your study to steal the Blackwood legacy." Ellen stepped forward. She didn't look at the crowd, she looked at the inspector. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the pocket watch. The crystal inside was now a steady, glowing amber, pulsating with a warmth that seemed to calm the very air in the room. "My name is Ellen Ripley," she said, her voice clear and resonant. "Daughter of Arthur Ripley, the man your records say failed the crown. My father didn't fail. He saved you from a weapon he knew you weren't ready to wield. And today the Duke and I didn't just survive an accident. We stabilized the heart of this kingdom." She placed the watch on the inspector's table. As his hand neared it, the metal of the watch didn't burn him. It hummed, a gentle, welcoming vibration that spoke of infinite, peaceful energy. "The challenge," Bruce announced, his voice booming, "is over. Every woman who came here looking for a title failed because they were looking for a prize. They wanted to own Blackwood. But Ellen Ripley, she was the only one brave enough to heal it." Tommy lunged forward, desperation finally snapping his composure. "It's mine. The title is mine by right of sanity." He reached for a concealed pistol in his coat, but the guards, men who had served Bruce's father and had seen the Duke return from the dead, moved faster. They tackled Tommy to the marble floor before he could level the weapon. In the chaos that followed as Tommy was dragged away screaming about legacies and shadows, the crowd fell into a hushed, reverent awe. The Duke didn't look at the guards or the inspectors or the disgraced spare. He turned to Ellen. In front of the wealthiest and most judgmental eyes in the realm, the Duke of Blackwood dropped to one knee. He didn't take her hand to kiss it as a superior, he took it as a partner. "The engine is running, Ellen," Bruce whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. "But it needs a rhythm. It needs the anchor. Will you stay? Not as a maid, not as a prize, but as the Duchess who brought the light back to this house." The twist wasn't in the proposal. It was in the reaction. Ellen didn't cry. He didn't hesitate. She reached down, took the Duke's face in her hands and pulled him up to his feet. "I'm not staying for the house, Bruce," she said, a playful, emotional spark in her eyes. "I'm staying for the man who was brave enough to stand with me in the dark." The great hall, once a cavern of cold judgment and frozen time, was now flooded with a light that didn't just illuminate. It felt alive. The trial of the Crimson Rose had been dismantled, replaced by a legacy of truth. As the years bled into a golden era for Blackwood, the manor transformed from a fortress of grief into a beacon of progress. The engine, stabilized by the harmony between Bruce and Ellen, provided clean, infinite energy that pulled the surrounding valley out of poverty, turning the gray lands into a sprawling garden of innovation and life. But the true transformation was found in the quiet moments between the new Duke and Duchess. 6 months after the night of the explosion, the manor was hosting its first true celebration. Not a cold gala for the elite, but a harvest festival for the people who actually kept the kingdom running. Clarice Starling, now the chief administrator of the estate, stood on the balcony, watching with a rare, genuine smile as the townspeople danced in the courtyard. Beside her, Victor Frankenstein marveled at the pocket watch, now housed in a glass casing in the center of the hall, its amber pulse a constant, reassuring heartbeat for the home. Ellen stood at the edge of the rose garden, no longer wearing gray wool, but a gown of deep emerald silk that caught the light of the setting sun. She looked down at her hands. They still bore the faint, silvery scars from the night she touched the core. She didn't hide them. To her, they were the most beautiful jewelry she owned. A map of the moment she chose to stop being a shadow. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind. Bruce leaned his chin on her shoulder, the scent of rain and parchment replaced by the smell of blooming jasmine and the warmth of a man who was finally at peace. "The clocks are all synchronized, Ellen," Bruce whispered, pressing a kiss to the side of her neck. "For the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of the next second. I'm not waiting for the other shoe to drop." "That's because you aren't walking alone anymore, Bruce," Ellen replied, turning in his arms to face him. The Duke's face, once a mask of obsidian, was now soft, his eyes reflecting the woman who had dared to look at his wreckage and call it home. "I found something in the archives today," Bruce said, pulling a small weathered leather book from his vest. "It was my father's personal journal. The last entry wasn't about the engine or the physics of the vacuum. It was a note to me. It said, 'To my son, if the machine fails, do not look for a better wrench. Look for a better reason to stay.'" He tucked a stray lock of amber hair behind her ear. "You were the reason, Ellen. You were the only reason the world started spinning again." They stood together as the sun dipped below the horizon, watching the golden lights of the valley flicker on, powered by the very heart they had saved. There were no more challenges, no more secrets, and no more shadows. Just the steady, rhythmic pulse of a love that had been forged in the dark and brought into the light. Thank you so much for embarking on this 40-minute journey with us through the halls of Blackwood Manor. It has been an absolute joy to share this story of resilience and hidden strength with you. If you felt the tension of the cellar or the triumph of Ellen's emergence, please leave a comment below. I read every single one and love hearing your thoughts on the twists. If you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Join our community of story lovers so you never miss a tale. We have so many more mysteries and emotional journeys waiting for you. Until next time, stay brave, stay kind, and remember, even the quietest soul can change the rhythm of the world.